This is the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. I'm your host, Amanda Kendall of the notaballerina.com travel blog. Every episode I'll share travel tales from several fellow travel lovers, and together we hope to entertain and inspire you, remind you of some of your own great travel experiences, and encourage you to hit the road again soon. Hello and welcome to episode 232 of the Thoughtful Travel Podcast. It's a very special one. I'll tell you why. I have just poured some bubbly to celebrate reaching 500,000 downloads. Pretty excited. Now, as many listeners will know, I was actually very keen to reach this milestone last week by the 5th birthday of the podcast, but it took a few extra days. Still, that's okay. This morning, in fact, around 2 a.m, I was awake and trying to get my sick son to go back to bed. He's fine, just got a bad cold and, middle of the night he couldn't breathe. But I checked my download stats while I was waiting and I found that it had just ticked over to the magical 500,000. So big thanks, everyone. Thanks to everyone who listens regularly. Thanks to everyone who's shared the Thoughtful Travel Podcast with friends, and everyone who's given me delightful feedback and reviews. I appreciate all of this so much. Without you guys, there is no podcast. So thank you very, very much. Now, I do know that compared to some big podcasts, 500,000 downloads is nothing, but it's not completely nothing, I guess. The longevity and regularity of publishing the Thoughtful Travel Podcast is kind of pushing it up the rankings every year. I looked into the stats because, remember, I have a maths degree. I really like numbers. And at the moment, that average number of downloads per episode for my podcast is always over 1,000, sometimes a bit more. And I found some recent stats for podcasts across the board, and they go like this. If your new episode gets within the first week of its release more than 539 downloads, you're in the top 5% of all podcasts. If it gets more than 3,062 downloads, you're in the top 1% of podcasts. So with my 1,000 or so, I'm very easily into the top 5%, still a long way off the top 1%, but something to aim for. And I think the top 5% of podcasts is a pretty good place to be anyway. Numbers, of course, are just part of the whole equation, but, I do really like them as well. But it's definitely not all of it because I have so many other wonderful things I love about running this podcast. Most of all, the people I get to talk to, my fabulous guests, the people in the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, everyone who listens and gives me feedback in any place. It's just so rewarding to hear about these things. So you might remember a couple of episodes ago, and this is the kind of thing I just love happening. I played a little clip of some noisy Aussie birds here. And in the podcast, in the Facebook group, the Thoughtful Travellers Facebook group, I had a fabulous listener come on and say, hey, I played that episode in a barn I was working in. I was on my own, so I was playing it very loudly. And when those Aussie birds started squawking, suddenly all the birds, the American birds in the barn, went nuts. So we don't know what the Aussie birds were saying, but the American birds all went crazy and squawking. So there you go. I'm even getting intercultural connections between birds across continents. So I really loved hearing that story. So anyway, apart from raving about numbers, I will stop. But to celebrate this 500,000 and 5-year milestone, I actually want to talk first a bit about how I got here. And then after that, I have some travel stories, which are, they're both random and curiously relevant. But you'll have to wait to find out why. So, how did I get here to 500,000 downloads in 5 years of a podcast? This is the girl who I'm unable to be employed in one job for very long. I get bored. In fact, I haven't had a proper job for well over a decade because self-employment seems to be the only thing that suits me. And the longest I ever worked on one thing at once was working at Kentucky Fried Chicken at KFC as a teenager, as a high school and uni student. I lasted there for 4 years. So suddenly I'm able to do things like this podcast for 5 years and 500,000 downloads. So I'm almost surprised. But it's funny how these things work, because I guess as fate would have it, this week I've been listening to the audiobook of a great book called Grit by Angela Duckworth. Now, I first read Grit, I think 3 or 4 years ago, probably not long after it came out. It was recommended in lots of self-employed circles, I suppose. And I read it more in the context of my social media and blogging business than anything else. It's about passion and persistence and how to, in my words, make the most of life. So how to, achieve something you really want to achieve. So when I first read Grit a few years back, I had already started the Thoughtful Travel podcast, but I also had lots of other work going on. I mean, as I still do now, like running social media training and workshops and consulting, doing freelance writing, giving public talks, all sorts of stuff. And when I read it, I felt at the time like being gritty, as Angela Duckworth describes it, which is like showing passion and persistence, was really that really applied to those things, the quote unquote real work things. And that's probably because at the time it was relatively new that I was a single parent and I really needed to focus on what would pay the mortgage. So that work really needed to do its job for me so that I could pay the mortgage. But this time round, with all of that work, kind of under control, ticking along without too much stress, the mortgage more or less being taken care of without as much stress as back then. So this time around, it's really fascinating to hear Angela Duckworth talk about having what she calls a philosophy of life and having one really big important goal that a lot of your work is going towards. And I noticed as I listened that thanks in part to the pandemic and also in part just to continuing to be persistent. I mean, 232 episodes of this podcast in 5 years, I suppose, shows that I'm doing pretty well on persistence. Now I know really I have a much better idea of what I'm working towards. And it's what I've always wanted, really, to write and to travel and to combine these. But although a few years back, I obviously knew that being a thoughtful traveller was important to me, or I wouldn't have started the Thoughtful Travel podcast. But now I really, really, really know. And I think that's partly thanks to COVID-19. There you go. And I really know that there's several ways that I really want to pass on this kind of thoughtful travel knowledge and doctrine almost. And the two very important ones being to continue to make this podcast and to reach an even wider audience, and to write books about thoughtful travel. And as regular listeners will know, the first one of these books, Why We Must Travel, the current working title, being shopped around to agents at the moment and getting some encouraging feedback. And I'm just starting work on another book. So those things are kind of really the things I really want to be working on, and lots of my tasks in life are focusing on finding ways to fit those in and to make them really work. So it was really interesting. I feel much more focused, I suppose. So it was interesting to think about it. So I guess I really say this to remind everyone, if you really want to do something, keep doing it, and maybe read Grit by Angela Duckworth. So having said all that, now that I can kind of consider the Thoughtful Travel podcast to be quite established, for want of a better word, I've got lots and lots of ideas to take it further. I want to work more on the Patreon content. I've got ideas for some thoughtful merchandise. I want to run some more courses. Definitely want to keep up the book club. I love running the book club. And I also have kind of an additional related series of episodes with local people that I've been planning and starting to record. Lots and lots of ideas. And I'm looking forward to getting to all of them, I think, during the rest of this year. So finally, for a bit of fun, I said I had some travel stories as well. So this is how I came to these stories. I thought, since this milestone is the 5th anniversary of the podcast, well, I checked what the traditional gift is for a 5th anniversary, a wedding anniversary gift, and it's wood. So I thought I can twist this around to travel, and I thought my anniversary gift to my podcast needs to be some travel stories about woods. And as it turns out, I have a few particularly memorable moments from being in the woods. So here we go. The first one, I was 14. Gosh, that seems so long ago. I was 14 years old and on our school trip to Germany in 1990. See, it is a really long time ago. And I remember very, very vividly stomping through a small forest near Bonn with some of my friends on that trip and our host sisters, the girls we were staying with. And it was a great gang of people. I remember doing lots of crazy things together, things like going to the local cafe, and they introduced us to a drink, which was orange juice with a scoop of vanilla ice cream in it. Weird. I don't think I would choose it today, but I loved it then. And I remember chanting together with them as we day tripped around Bonn. We were chanting Bonn bleibt Hauptstadt because it was just days before Germany, Western East Germany, was being reunified, and then Bonn would no longer be the capital city. That would go back to Berlin. And of course, these girls living near Bonn, they quite liked having the capital city near them, so they would say Bonn bleibt Hauptstadt, Bonn remains the capital city. But on this particular walk through the forest towards the end of our week near Bonn, when we'd all really bonded, no pun intended, these German hosts, our teenage host sisters, started teaching us swear words in German. And it's a story I have heard time and time again from podcast guests and other fellow travellers too, that the moment you know you've really connected with locals is when they start teaching you to swear in the local language. Crazy, but true. Now, my next woods tale for you is from a decade and a bit later, 2003, at Nida in Lithuania on the Curonian Spit. So the Curonian Spit is a little strip of land. It reaches out from Lithuania, and part of it belongs to that kind of funny enclave of Russia, Kaliningrad. It's worth looking it up on a map if you look for Kaliningrad, and you can see this long spit between Klaipėda in Lithuania and Svetlogorsk in this Kaliningrad. It's this very long, skinny spit. It's kind of a really crazy geographical feature. But anyway, I digress. What I remember, got to get to the woods, remember. What I remember was walking through the pine forest there for a morning, part of a morning, and then coming out just to the edge of the forest to the beach. It was a super windy beach on the Curonian Spit there. And like kind of incongruously, there was like a kind of an oil rig production plant, blah, blah. I don't know what it was exactly, but something just a bit further down the beach. It was really a real blight on that beach. But anyway, my boyfriend at the time, we were travelling together, was a keen amateur photographer, and I must have dilly-dallied or something because he was much further down the beach taking photos. I was still on the kind of the edge in the woods. And I saw a woman, an elderly woman, a local I assume, she was the only other person around. I saw a woman standing in the shallows of the water, and it was summer, but I was in a thick jacket and the wind was intense. It was cold. I had no idea how she could swim. I was still trying to shelter in the woods rather than on the beach because the trees kind of gave me some wind protection. Anyway, after a while, I got a little bit closer, I suppose, and I realised that the woman was naked and going for a swim, but sort of standing in the shallows. And then I realised that my boyfriend was taking photos from much further down, and he was actually pointing his camera towards her. Now, I knew that I could only just see that she was naked. He was much further away. I knew that he didn't know, but I was worried that suddenly someone would see him doing this and think that he knew what he was doing, and we'd suddenly be thrown in some Lithuanian prison for taking pornographic pictures or something. So I sprinted through the forest. There was a kind of a path in it to catch up with him and warn him and say, "Stop taking pictures." It all ended fine, and the woman never even looked at us. Maybe she didn't even see us. She was standing looking out to sea. But it all ended well, but I will always remember that morning on the edge of the forest on the Curonian Spit. Now, my final quick woods story is a more modern woods story from, in fact, 2020, I guess, from a forest from the Eco Park in Kuala Lumpur in Malaysia. This was a place my son and I explored on what proved to be our last international trip for some time, who knows how long, some 14 months ago now, just before COVID hit. In fact, until now, that was even our last plane trip. So the KL Eco Park is this stunning rainforest. It's right near the centre of the city. If you've been to KL, you've probably seen it. We could see the forest right from our very central apartment. It's just next to the famous KL Tower. There are a set of suspension bridges within the Eco Park, and you can walk a circuit through the trees, like up high, bird's eye view level through the trees. And it was beautiful. My son and I both loved it so much, we walked this whole suspension bridge circuit twice. And of course, we didn't know then that we were in our final days of pre-pandemic travel. But fortunately, like we generally tend to do when we travel, we made the most of it. And now it's even a more special memory. So hopefully we get to make some more of those memories again soon. Anyway, those are my woods stories for my 5th anniversary. I hope you enjoyed them. In fact, my son told me as he was listening to some old episodes a few weeks ago that I should tell more of my stories. So I'm doing what he asked. So there you go. So anyway, just thanks again to everyone who ever listens, and especially to everyone who's left such heartwarming messages of congratulations and support. I really love hearing from you all. It really makes this a very special thing. So that's it. Thanks for listening to episode 232 of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. I've left just a couple of links in the show notes. One is a link to some stats, some modern, current stats of downloads for a podcast, just so you can see where my stats that I listed fit in. And I will also leave a link to the book Grit by Angela Duckworth, just in case you're curious. So quite unusual and different links compared to normal. Don't forget to come along and join the Facebook group for Thoughtful Travellers. Just search for Thoughtful Travellers in Facebook or have a look in the show notes. And for this episode, the show notes are at notaballerina.com/232. As always, but especially this time because you've all helped me reach this pretty exciting download milestone, thank you very, very, very much for listening. This has been another episode of the Thoughtful Travel podcast. Show notes and other information are at notaballerina.com/podcast. Join me again soon for another chat about why we travel. Bye for now.